Hi there, this is Emily Metcalf, one of the health science librarians at Grand Valley State University. Today we're going to talk about how to read a scholarly article. One of the misconceptions around scholarly research is that you have to read every article top to bottom, word for word. There's no skimming, there's no jumping. You're obligated to read the whole thing the way it's laid out. Happily, that's not the case. Research is laid out in a particular way so that all researchers more or less know what they're getting into when they look at the full text of an article. You can see we've got title at the top, we have our authors, we have the date it was published, we also have our abstract. This is a very important part of the article because it's essentially a summary. This is where you're going to spend your time and decide whether or not reading the full text of the article is worth your time. So the first section after the abstract is the background. Sometimes this is also called the introduction, and this is where you're going to learn things like key terms. If the authors will be using acronyms throughout the paper, they will often lay them out here. You can see, for example, this article uses the phrase World Trade Organization, and in parentheses it says WTO. That means any time in this article when they say WTO, they're referring to the World Trade Organization. Often this is also the place in this paper where they're going to lay out the importance of doing this research. Why was it worthwhile for the authors to study this topic? After the background, if we scroll just a little bit, we can see the next section is methods. And here the methods section has subsections, including study design and setting, the instruments that they used. For example, here's the layout of what looks like maybe a survey people responded to. Here they discuss how they validated their research, how they collected the data, and how they analyzed the data. The next section is the results. So not just how did they go about doing the research, but what did they learn? Often the results are very complicated. This is where lots of statistical information is incorporated. And for me personally, this isn't really a great use of my time because I don't have the statistical knowledge to really understand what they're saying. So personally, I prefer to get an understanding of what they learned, not from the results section, but if we scroll a little bit further, from the discussion section. The discussion is where they talk about what they learned, not using statistics, but just using language that many researchers can understand. And this language they're using might include some jargon. It might be sort of really specific to a certain discipline, but it's still, for me, easier to understand what they learned from the discussion section than it is in the results. So this discussion takes up a good portion of the paper. If I scroll just a little bit, you'll see we have subpoints, including practical implications. And we also have limitations in future research. This is an important part of any scholarship. Sometimes it gets its own section or subsection like it does here. Sometimes this part is incorporated into the discussion or into the conclusion, but this is where the researchers tell you what were they not able to accomplish. No single piece of research can cover every possibility, and so this is where the authors are laying out what they were able to accomplish and what future researchers might choose to add on to when it becomes their turn to study this topic. Lastly, we have the conclusion, and just like it says, this is the authors concluding. They are telling you what they studied, they're reminding you what their results were, and they're reminding you where this research could go in the future. I'm going to scroll just a little bit further to show you the next section. You can see they have some acknowledgments. These are people who maybe helped out with their research. They have authorship contributions, so who did what. They list no funding. They say that it wasn't applicable, which means no one funded this research, no organization or person funded this research. And that's important to know, especially when we're studying something like medical tourism. If these authors had been funded by the Medical Tourism Bureau of Iran, we might be a little more suspicious of their findings. They might have a bias in them, whether or not that's something they're aware of. So it's important to understand where the funding is coming from. And lastly, the authors list where you can access the data from this article if you choose to pursue this topic further. Now, at the very, very bottom, we have references. And this is the start of their reference section. And if we scroll just a little bit, we see it continues onto a second page. And the references are, of course, very important because it tells us where the authors are getting their information, and it helps us track down certain things. While we're reading this article, we might be really curious about a certain component. We can come down to the references and we can sort of follow where our curiosity leads us. Even if this article doesn't answer the question we were hoping to, one of its sources might. So that's the basic layout of an article like this. There's almost always a background or intro, methods, results, discussion, and conclusion. And there are always references. There should always be references. The only exception is maybe if it is an opinion piece where someone is not actually citing anyone else's work. Now, how do you read this thing? I'm going to scroll way back to the top to show you how I would go about reading this. And this is just how I do this. This is not how you have to read it, but it's just an example to show you that no one reads these things top to bottom. We jump around, we skim, and we take what we need. So I'll have already read the title. That's what would have gotten me into this article in the first place. Then I read the abstract to make sure it's useful to me. I'm a librarian, so I am interested in the keywords. Not everyone is. You do not have to be. So I'll skim those. And then I do spend some time in the background section. If you're researching a topic you know a lot about, you might be able to skip this. Personally, lots of the topics I work with students on, they aren't things that I have expertise in, and so the background is a really important place for me to get a good grasp of what we're talking about. Now, after the background, I actually just skip all the way down through the methods, right to the conclusion. That's where I go next. And that seems counterintuitive. It seems like I'm jumping from the top to the bottom, and I am, but that's because I sort of want to understand the gist of this article. I want to know what it's going to say before I really spend a lot of mental energy committing to understanding the research. So I read the background, I come and I read the conclusion, and then I actually go back and I read the discussion. This is, for me, the most important place to understand what the researchers actually learned and how it applies to their field and even broader implications if that's relevant. So I spend some time on the discussion. From here, if I'm really interested, I might go back and read the methods. I might go back and I read the results. But for the most part, I'm probably done reading, unless maybe one of the citations has really stood out to me and I want to see the references. I'm probably done reading. In some cases, what you're researching might be how to do research. And in that case, you're probably going to jump into an article and you're just going to read the methods section. Maybe when you're studying statistics, you just want to read the results and the discussion so you can see how statistically relevant their results were and how they apply to the field. You're allowed to jump around. It is okay, it is normal, and that's what I encourage you to do. Most importantly, you need to make sure that when you're communicating about any article, you need to make sure you understand the context the information is coming from, and you need to make sure that you are relaying it faithfully in your work. Now, if that means you need to look through every piece of the article, that's okay. But you are allowed to jump around, and I encourage you to do so, especially when you are juggling a variety of classes and a variety of projects. It's okay to just take what you need from an article. So that's how I read a scholarly article. If you have questions about that, you can always reach out to me or the libraries at gvsu.edu/library. Happy researching!